Morning, everyone.
Yes.
We'll call today the beginning of the end. This is a long amount of DVD, and that's why we're splitting it up into 2 days. So it's about an hour and 39 minutes if you want to watch it all. So we'll stop at some point today, but this is a good end to it. This is the end of it's mountains after the flood. And they figure this is when the Rockies were made, basically, where the clashing of the tectonic plates made the Rocky Mountains all the way down through South America and whatnot. So that happened after the flood was completed, and adjusted all of the soft sediment that's there. Now, what they'll say here is that this film was or this project that they're going to work on at first was 4 years in the making. And the reason for the 4 years, I mentioned it earlier in an earlier one, is that you can't take a rock, even a little pebble. You're not supposed to take it out of the Grand Canyon, correct, Jim?
That's right.
I mean, it was.
This is the pockets, right?
I mean, some of those packs that we were all loading onto the thing got heavier as the time went on, so we didn't open them. But they did get heavier, but you were not allowed to take anything out of the Grand Canyon. Of course, it's a national park, blah, 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 this and that, but you can get permits to go in and do research. And that's what these guys were looking for. And so they put in their permits, or their requests for permits and stuff, and they kept getting replies back, well, how about this? You know, they had to continue to give more than what they were really supposed to. And finally, they went with the Alliance Defense Fund and sued Park, the National Parks Department. And so, long story short, it got up to the Washington Bureau of National Parks. And they didn't want any part of it. They said, just give them the permit, allow them to do it. After the fact, they got a FOIA request to see what happened. And they got some emails back and forth with the people inside the Parks Department said, can you imagine what information they were going to gain from what they're asking about, what that's going to do in a creationist's hands? And you'll see what they mean by that. They're trying to stop it. They didn't want it because it would have shown what they'll show you here shortly, what they'll find. It may not be in today's, but they'll at least show you what they're doing. So let's start off with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this time. We thank you, Lord, for your flood and all the clues that you have left, and helping us to decipher through all of this. And we look forward to the worship service today. Hope it's pleasing in your sight, and that you open our minds and our hearts and do for what you want us to learn today. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you for Jim for figuring this out. He says it was easy, and I'm going to trust that it was.
YouTube University. Class.
I flunk every one of them. So, all right, it does have chapters, but I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And when we get close to the end, I'll leave about 10 minutes because there's always some discussion afterhand. And if you have any questions, just ask. And here we go. Same players, you'll see a lot of them. Come on.
Try playing the video first and this is play.
Hmm?
Try playing the video first.
Ah. Thank you, Jill. Oh, Delvin against you. Just a little bit. Well, he's speaking over it, I think. May not be there. We were there, Jim. We were there.
This is Lee's Ferry. I've been here many times. It's where we always load the boats when we start our Grand Canyon trips. This is my friend, Tom Vale. He started Canyon Ministries and took me on my very first trip down the canyon. No one knows the canyon better than Tom, and I was fortunate to have him as my guide on all the canyon trips I've taken. This is Dr. Andrew Snelling, and sitting next to him is Dr. John Whitmore. Both are geologists. You may recall Andrew from our last film, Is Genesis History? Remember, Andrew took me to an extinct volcano in Arizona to discuss radioisotope dating and the age of the Earth. John was Andrew's assistant on this trip. He's been a geology professor at Cedarville University for over 30 years. He has also spent a lot of time studying the Coconino Sandstone layer in the Grand Canyon. The conventional paradigm says the Coconino Sandstone was formed over millions of years in a desert by the wind. But John's research has clearly shown that it was formed rapidly underwater during the flood. This is a key piece of evidence for the creation model. Little did I know that the same year we released Is Genesis History in theaters, Andrew was embarking on a research project down in the canyon. He was looking for new evidence that many of the enormous layers of sediment we see all around the world were laid down during the flood. One of the things that has always fascinated creation scientists are the huge folds that can be seen in the canyon and all over the world. Andrew had a theory he wanted to test. If his theory was correct, it would be important new evidence regarding Earth history and the geological timetable. These two scientists have spent much of their lives finding evidence that supports the history of Genesis. But in all those instances, their work was never filmed. This time was different. They took a cameraman with them into the canyon to capture what they were doing. When I heard about it, I realized that this was a way to show something most people have never seen: creation scientists doing the actual work of science. How do scientists connect the history in Genesis with the world around us? How do they test their theories? And what did the flood do to create the world we live in today? Our first documentary provided an overview of creation science. But in this documentary, we're going to explore how creation science actually works, because it is important that you see for yourself how scientists do science. I'm Del Tackett. I'm excited to be your guide as we explore the rise of mountains after the flood. Although I wasn't a part of their first trip to the canyon, I met them many times on their journey. And just like the first film, I learned an incredible amount. But this time, I found myself asking questions I had never thought to ask before.
So this is John's lab?
Yeah, I've been here at Cedarville for 30 years now. And done a lot of work in this lab and a couple other labs that are next door to this one. Over here we have what's called the petrographic microscope. This is a microscope that's designed for looking at thin sections. And this is what a thin section.
The slides
Yep.
that Ray produces for you?
Yep, this is what Ray makes. These are from his lab in Calgary. And he takes a rock like this and will slice a really thin layer off of it and glue it on a glass slide and then polish it down so you can see through it. And you know, if you hold it up to the light, you can see the light passes
Just
right through
amazing.
that. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so that allows us to study the sand grains under the microscope. So
It's quite an art to make the thin sections.
yeah, here's I've got a slide on the microscope right now, and this is one of the thin sections from the Coconino sandstones, and it has what we call ooids in here, and these are dolomite ooids.
Ovoid
Yeah,
shapes.
they look like balls almost, and what happens is you get a little sand grain rolling around in the surf or rolling around on an ocean bottom. As it rolls around, just like a kid rolling a snowball, you know how a snowball gets bigger?
Yeah.
These little sand grains accumulate the dolomite around them.
So you can see the sand grain in the middle,
Yeah.
that white spot, and all the coating around it.
You know, this was amazing evidence for us. I still remember opening up my email, looking at this, and I was just amazed because this is just incredible evidence that the coconino was made underwater. You can't make these kinds of things in a desert. I presented this at a National Geology meeting, and I had a scientist come up that knew I was a young Earth creationist and was skeptical about all the work I had done. And every geologist would look at that and know that those were ooids, except if
We've
they're
had
in the
coconino in front of the name.
Isn't that interesting?
As soon as it was
So it's
coconino.
just, I don't want to see this.
Yeah, he just would not look at
Okay.
it, would not admit, would not even study them to see if they were ooids or not. And he just said, nope, those can't be ooids, those aren't ooids. And, you know, wanted to drop the subject almost immediately. I pressed him on it a little bit, but he didn't want to go any further on
So
it.
what happens when someone is captive in a paradigm,
Yeah.
they don't want to see any evidence
Yep.
that's contrary to that paradigm, and that's what was happening to him.
Yeah, that's one of the neat things that we do as creation scientists. We kind of have a different way of looking at things, and so we tend to collect data and look for data that probably other people miss, or probably they might have seen it, but they really don't think very deeply about it and think about the implications. And that's one of the things I think I enjoy most about a creation scientist, because there are so many discoveries out there that are just waiting for us.
We're not constrained. We're able to ask questions that they're not asking.
And so
And that's
we,
what's kind of driven you to this research now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because the conventional paradigm would have never gone in to take samples.
No, they haven't.
To look
They've
at that
just- They've
fold.
just talked about these folds and just assumed that they were formed long after the rocks were
Right.
formed, and therefore there had to be mechanisms that allowed the rock to bend when it was very hard. As creation scientists, we think these layers were laid down during the flood. The folding occurred only a year later, at the end of the flood, when the mountains and plateaus were rising in the west. If that's the case, we wouldn't expect there to be evidence of the rocks changing under heat and pressure. That's what we're investigating and why we're making thin sections to look inside the rocks. From looking at it, anyone looking at these folds, you can see immediately they're so smooth that it seemed intuitively that these had to have been formed when they were soft. But we had to go in and get the samples so we could confirm that, plus rule out any objections that might be raised. So it's all part of doing good science. Well, I've been doing research in the Grand Canyon for 27 years. Here in the Grand Canyon, you've got exposed to view virtually a whole slice through Earth history. And so that's why it's important, because it's been used at Exhibit A for millions of years and biological evolution. And that's why it's important that creationists also come to the Grand Canyon and say, no, it's Exhibit A for creation and the flood.
What's the choice?
I can do either one, Andrew. You deep enough over there?
Over here, okay.
We're coming into the Depeat Sandstone here, outcropping at river level. This is our target rock unit. This is our first sample. This is the same sandstone as in the Carbon Canyon Fold. It's a good spot because it's something like 5 miles from Carbon Canyon Fold. If the sediments were still soft, we wouldn't expect to find any difference with the sample here to the sample in the fold. Shattered on me. I'm marking where the bedding is so we can reorient it in the lab. TSS standing for Depeat Sandstone Sample 1.
Let's stop for a second though and go back a little bit and talk about, first of all, where the rocks came from and how you got them and why. and so forth, so that we can kind of lead up to what the research is about.
Well, a lot of people ask me the question, now, why the Grand Canyon? Let's start with something basic. The reason why the Grand Canyon is a geologist's paradise is that you've got this giant slice in the earth where the canyon and exposes all these layers. It's in a desert. It's almost a showcase in the textbooks about all these different rock layers. And so the question is, you know, when did they form? How did they form? What is their history? We now know that many of these layers that we see exposed in the walls of the Grand Canyon stretch, in some cases, right across the North American continent and beyond.
So Andrew, the layer we were looking at in Grand Canyon is the Tapeats sandstone that's down near the bottom of the Grand Canyon. We can trace that layer into the Colorado Rocky Mountains near Colorado Springs. We can trace it into the Black Hills, and we can trace that same layer up to Greenland as a continuous sheet with no breaks in it.
So that kind of an understanding of a layer that is so huge leads your thinking more to something global than just in something local.
So that tells you something not only about the scale, but we think the flood eroded away enormous sections of the pre-flood continents, then deposited that material in layers one on top of the other. It's like a stack of pancakes miles deep all over the earth.
And so when we talked about the layers, those layers are all formed as a result of sediment, right? Talk about those layers, first of all, and how they were formed, and the layers in that we wanted to look at and why we wanted to look at them.
We wanted to look at those specific layers because they're at the bottom of that huge stack. If those layers were still soft when they were folded, they can't be hundreds of millions of years old.
So imagine the sand being washed up on a beach. How does it get cemented? How does it turn from sand into sandstone? So what happens is when it's deposited, there's water in between those sand grains, but the water has chemicals dissolved in it. And so when the water dries out, those chemicals precipitate and fill in all the spaces between the sand grains and harden it, making it a cement.
We think a lot of that cement and some of the grains would have broken if the layers were hard when they were bent.
Well, after the layers were deposited, everyone agrees that the Colorado Plateau was pushed up. It was part of the mountain building event connected to the Rocky Mountains. We think this was happening at the end of the flood when major earth movements were creating new plateaus and mountain ranges. The folded layers are the result of those movements. It's like a book. Here are the various sandstone, shale, limestone.
These are all the sedimentary layers.
Sediment now exposed by the canyon, but this was pushed up. Now, what's interesting is that the eastern side of the canyon, the layers have been buckled like that. They haven't been pushed up uniformly. And so there's been folding of the layers. And that was the focus of our research, because the conventional view is that these layers were deposited over 500 million years ago. And this folding, they say, didn't occur until 70 million years ago. So there's a gap of several hundred million years. And if that, in that time frame, you'd expect the water to dry out between all the grains, the cement to harden. Now, you know as well as I do that if you try to bend that rock, what's going to happen?
Well, first of all, I can't bend that rock, but if I think about this one.
What's going to happen?
So if this, for example, let's say this then represented that plateau that you're talking about.
Yes.
And so if we were to put pressure underneath this in order to try and bend it, and if it's hardened like this, then we would say
it's going to snap.
It's going to crumble.
It's going to crumble. So you can bend a rock like this, hard rock, like you've got there, but you've got to do it slowly with pressure and heat. And the heat and the pressure makes the rock plastic and in a sense makes it like putty, and it will bend slowly. But because of the heat and pressure, that is going to affect the mineral grains, is going to affect the cement that binds the mineral grains together. In the conventional paradigm of millions of years, you can only cause that bending if you have heat and pressure causing metamorphic changes in the rock. And those changes will show up clearly in the thin sections. And therefore, we want to look under the microscope. Is there any evidence in these layers that have been bent of those metamorphic changes? And that was a major point, because we have to be able to show that there hasn't been those changes if it all occurred very rapidly when the rock was still soft.
So that's what drew your attention to the folds and the desire then to do the study and the research at a more detailed level.
And the interesting thing is, Del, because we have a different framework of thinking to look at these issues, we're asking different questions to what the mainstream geologists are asking. They haven't taken samples and cut these thin sections to look at the grains under the microscope. But that's very basic to understand. People can't, it's hard for people to grasp, but you know, we're going to go to the microscope scale to explain and look at the timing of the formation of mountains.
Right.
We're zoomed in on this research project on these folds, but they are part of a bigger context. What produced these folds? So at the end of the flood, as the ocean basins were sinking and pulling the floodwaters off the continents, an oceanic plate from the Pacific Basin went under Western North America at a fairly flat angle.
And as a result, this plate caused a number of mountains and plateaus to rise up almost to the middle of the continent, which is why there are so many high plateaus and mountains in the western United States.
One enormous area that was lifted up was the Colorado Plateau. But the plateau didn't lift up evenly, and so some areas were pushed up higher than others.
Now here's what's interesting, Del. A very large fold that goes through that area, hundreds of miles long. It's the same one Andrew was referring to, and it's called the East Kaibab monocline, where mono refers to one bend or one fold. The monocline formed a dam. Water started collecting in the lower area, and so a big lake developed and eventually found a weak point in the monocline and started to flow through it. And it was that catastrophic dam burst, we believe, that carved out the Grand Canyon.
And so it's because of the carving of the canyon that we have these folds exposed to view. And these are the places that we sampled.
Let me show you on a map where we...
Oh yeah, I'd love to see that.
So this is a geological map. You can see it's been well used.
Well used. I've had this out in the Grand Canyon many times in my pack.
You know, I can tell that if you're going to be a geologist, you need to learn how to unfold and fold maps.
That's right. Yeah, you'll notice that this is a very colorful map.
Yeah.
Every color on here is a different kind of rock layer.
When we floated down the canyon and looked
Right.
at the layers, these colors now represent
Yep.
what we were seeing.
Yep.
in the canyon.
Every color is a different layer. The Grand Canyon goes through here. It starts way up here. In fact, the very upper part is not even on the map, but it comes down through this way, wraps around down this way, goes off the map over there, and this is just the eastern part.
Yeah.
There's a whole nother western part that sits over there, and Lake Mead after that.
Is Carbon Canyon on here?
Yes, Carbon Canyon is up here. Okay, here we come down just below 60 Mile Rapids here. We took a regional sample just above the Little Colorado River, and we came down here, parked, and Carbon Canyon is up here.
Okay.
And here's the fault line.
Uh-huh.
And the fold is right on that fault line. That's the Butte Fault. And you can see it's a north-south, and that marks the edge of that monocline.
Yeah. So this is where you took the samples?
Yes, parked the boats, walked up to the fold. Carbon Canyon is a side canyon to the main Grand Canyon, and it cuts through the folded layers in the East Kaibab monocline. So we're coming up the drainage here of Carbon Creek, and got to go left and climb up this scree slope where there's steps. And so by hiking up Carbon Canyon, we come to the place where the Tapeats sandstone is actually bent through 90 degrees in a spectacular bend without the shattering. If we look ahead, you can follow the layering, essentially horizontal. And as we get towards the end of the canyon here, you can see the layers turn up to the skyline, almost vertical. So you can see the bend in the rocks. You know, you've been there before, but you've only got a mental picture. Now you're there in front of it. You want to check your strategy. You've already thought about what your strategy is, but now you've got to look, can I trace one particular band in the rock layers through the fold?
We've put orange duct tape in places where we want to sample, and that helps us keep track of the bed, so we make sure we follow the same bed through here. On my camera, I've got a GPS unit, and so when I take a photograph, if the GPS is locked in, it will tell me precisely where I took the photograph and where our sample came from.
It's getting really upfront and personal with the rocks. Take notes to record the location of the sample, the thickness of the bed, the dip and strike of the layer, if we can obtain that information. So it's a very intense, and of course you're working on a cliff face, so you've got to watch your footage.
Oh, that's a biggie.
And then we would go in and we'd take those samples in the specified way and mark the sample so we knew where was the top of the bed, because you've got to orient it. Labels the bag, put an extra card in with a sample number. It's back to basics. This is about actually taking measurements in the field, observations in the field, making notes, and then going to look at the samples under the microscope. It's very basic geology. And then you get your samples and you get out of there as quickly as possible back to a more hospitable place.
It's all.
You're in Disneyland here, yeah?
Yep, absolutely.
What is this to a geologist?
This is heaven on earth.
The nice thing about geologic maps is that the geologist will often draw a line across the map, and then he'll show you what the layers, what he thinks the layers look like underneath. So you can see these lines, like here's a B right here, and all the way up there is a B primed. And you can come down here to the map, and here's the B, and all the way over there is the B primed.
Awesome.
And notice that this particular line crosses the structure that is called the East Kaibab monocline, and that's the fault and fold partly associated with the Carbon Canyon area. And so right here is where the East Kaibab monocline goes through, and you see how the rocks are nice and flat right here, and then all of a sudden there's a bend.
Yes.
And there's a lower elevation down over here than back over here.
And so what happened, what we think happened, is the rock down here in the basement is really hard, and it broke and faulted, and that's the fault right there. But the rocks on top are relatively soft. And so as the hard rock pushed the softer rock up above, instead of breaking, these rocks up here bent and folded.
It's like having a layer of wet sand, and underneath you've got a wooden block, and you push the wooden block up and the sand will drape over the...
Right. That occurred somewhere then close to the flood time.
Yeah, well, Tapeats sandstone was deposited early in the flood, and at the end of the flood, when earth movements took place to re-equilibrate, that the folding occurred then, and the sediments were still damp and soft, and therefore they could bend quite easily, and then they dried out, and we had the cementation of the grains afterwards. And then we motored down here, and all the way past Phantom Ranch, all the way around here, come around to this is the Monument Fold. This is still the Tapeats sandstone. It's actually marked on the map that there's a fold there, but there's also a fault line.
There's a fault underneath, and the rock underneath pushed up and made the rocks on top fold because they're soft. We're going to be looking at this big fold or this big bend in the rock. You can see the granite and pushed up right here and making the big fold in the tapetes. And it looks like the tapetes has been plastically right over top of this fault. It doesn't look like the fault has extended up into the tapete sandstone at all.
And I think the easiest way to sample it is to come over and go up that slope to get to it there, and then come over and get to it on the other side of that slope.
Maybe that thin bed might be the better one to get because we're in the finer grain material.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, why don't you and I go up with the ladder?
Okay.
Let Andrew stay down here. We'll tape everything that we can do.
The plan is to sample 2 beds. Okay, the fold comes like this and does this. Okay, that's the overall profile. So because of the screw slope, we're going to sample in here and we're going to sample in here.
Well, it's just an interesting area that we want to try to sample. So we're going to take a sample right where this bed is kind of smeared.
And this is shifted this way, but it did so without cracking the rock.
So the rocks pose some questions to us. The folds pose some questions to us. And not just to a creation scientist, but to a conventional scientist as well. But then we want to go in there and study the rocks and look at that fold and look at the rocks under the microscope and see which paradigm fits the best.
And so the argument is not about that physical evidence, it's how you interpret that physical evidence. And to interpret it, you've got to have a framework. And our view of history is that Genesis is history. The Bible is an eyewitness account given to us by the Creator who was there. And it gives us a time frame, it gives us the description of what happened during the flood. And so we can take that description and look at the geological implications, for example, and then go out and test those implications.
Good, perfect.
Okay. 7 down, 1 to go.
So in your research was then to take samples in those folds, but you also took other samples.
Yes, well, as a control, we obviously collected samples away from the folds so that we can make comparisons. That's why we took samples from where the rocks are folded, and then we took regional samples from where the rocks are flat, but all in the same layer. If all the rocks from the different locations are the same, that's a strong indicator the layers were soft when they folded and therefore not millions of years old. And we made it all the way down and we did another regional sample at Doris Rapids.
Doris Rapids up in here.
And then Mat Katameeba, we looked at a fold in the Muave. But there were other samples we got in between of the Bright Angel Shale and the Muave limestone because these are the 3 units. And off the map we went to where we helicopter out, there's a fold there.
Yeah.
You got your pick on your side, you got your looper on your neck,
Ready to go up the ladder.
and you got
Got
a
all my
ladder.
tools on me, so I don't have to come down more than once.
A ladder like that, well, because the fold that we want to look at is at the base of a cliff, but it's still quite a climb up to it. And it's a vertical face. So we've brought this a ladder along so that we can get up to it.
Here you go, Tom.
This has been in the making for what, 4 years now? 4 years. We've talked about this for a long time beforehand, but the planning to make this happen has been going on for 4 years through the whole process of getting permission to do the sampling. This is significant because you can see the way it's being folded. That sort of plasticity that enables it to bend like that without shattering. You take a hard rock, it would have fractured all the way through there, and you'd see lots of evidence of that. But you don't. Sure, there's joints there, there's cracks, but they're not shatter type cracks. The whole rock would have just disintegrated with the bending motion.
You're not afraid of height, obviously.
No, I've done a lot of house painting in my years, so been on a lot of ladders. So this ladder was very stable. And glad my wife wasn't here.
So that's an overview of the project. And, you know, as we said before, the reason we wanted to do it is nobody had actually collected samples from these folds and looked at the rock under the microscope and studied them to determine the timetable for deposition, folding, and the cementation. You know, what's the order, which is critical.
I just think that this was one of the best raft trips I've been on in the Grand Canyon. I think we collected some good samples on the trip, and we'll be anxious to see what these things look like under the microscope.
Well, Andrew,
Here we are.
what do you have to say?
Well done, everyone. Fantastic trip.
When we were in Cedarville, we were looking at the maps and discussing all the research, but asked John if there was a place where we could actually go to see the forces that caused those folds, and that took us to the Uinta Mountains.
John, the vista here is unbelievable. What are we looking at here first?
So we're at the kind of the western end of the Uinta Mountains. They extend here out to the east for another 100 miles or more. And we're looking at some of the higher peaks in the Uintas, probably right around 13,000 feet here. It's beautiful, isn't it?
It is. It is phenomenal. John, can you take me back here for a second? Let's talk about how we got all of this.
Yeah, Del, I think these mountains that we're looking at actually rose at the end of the flood. So the earth was destroyed by the flood. And then as the flood ended, Psalm 104 tells us that the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. I think these mountains that we see in Western North America and all the other high and rugged mountains that we see around the world rose up at the end of Noah's flood. That's why they're so high. They were never eroded by the flood. Other mountains that rose up earlier in the flood, like the Appalachian Mountains or the Atlas Mountains, were eroded down to the smaller mountains that we see today by the floodwaters.
So during the flood, we have those massive sedimentary layers that are being laid all over, like the Tapete sandstone. You told me just covered most of North America.
Right.
Massive, massive. But they're horizontal, right?
They are.
All of those layers are horizontal. What happened then?
Well, we see some of the horizontal layers that are in these mountains towards the tops of these mountains. And these horizontal layers actually formed below sea level. So they formed during the flood, but they would have formed at depths that were much lower than we're 10,000 feet right now. And so they would have formed under the floodwaters. And then after the flood, they would have risen to the heights that they are now.
Was that a miraculous event, or can we see forces at play? That God, of course, was involved in that.
Sure.
But what forces would move mountains this size?
Well, we think it goes back to our idea of catastrophic plate tectonics. And so at the end of the flood, a plate was going under Western North America, creating the mountains like the Rockies and the Uintas. In South America, another plate was being subducted to create the high mountains and volcanoes of the Andes. And in Asia, two different plates collided to form the enormous mountain ranges of the Himalayas. In all these instances, we think the plates had to be moving very quickly to have the energy to create such high mountains. But these mountains formed at the very end of the flood, and that's why they're still so high.
Well, I guess the point, John, I hear you making is that even after the flood is over and Noah has landed in the ark, that there are a lot of catastrophic events that are going on all over.
That's
and
right.
That is what then shapes a lot of what we see.
You know, when Noah gets off the ark, it's not the end of catastrophe. To raise mountains up like this, you're going to have big earthquakes. And as these mountains rise, they're full of this wet, unconsolidated flood sediment. That's a recipe for huge landslides. Some of the biggest landslides that we know about are here in the southern part of Utah. So don't think of the mountains rising up as we see them right here, but think of a lot more rock in between here as these mountains originally rose up.
And so that erosion would even be more profound, I guess.
Yeah, we have big storms coming into the continents, and especially if you get those storms at high elevations like this, that water has a lot of energy as it runs downhill, many thousands of feet. Also at higher elevations like this, you have the opportunity for snow to fall. And if you have large amounts of snow that falls, you get the development of glacial ice.
And that glacial ice covered a lot of the northern part of North America then, did it not?
Yeah, it covered much of the Rockies. As you know, in Colorado, there's lots of glacial valleys there. Glaciers are one of the things that can carve those deep, steep-walled valleys in various places.
Would it be safe to say then that what we see today, not just here, but all over the world, is not what Noah saw when he got off the mountain?
That's right. And so those kinds of things, those kinds of catastrophes, help shape, help sculpt the mountains that we see today. Really nice scenery up here, isn't it?
It is beautiful, but it brings to mind here as we look at this, we have a lot of slanting of these layers. What's going on there?
So you can see the red rocks and the lighter tan-colored rocks back there. You can see they're sitting in an angle. So these layers used to be flat-lying. They're deposited in a marine setting. And these are the same rock layers that you would have seen down at the Vermilion Cliffs at the eastern end of Grand Canyon in Arizona. So here we are all the way up in northern Utah, and we're still seeing the same layers. But these layers would have had to be flat over this whole area, all the way down to Arizona and all the way up, extending into Wyoming. And then if you want to think about it as a bubble kind of rising up here, that's when those layers became slanted.
So we have the layers here on our right. Do those layers then continue and go underneath
They do.
the red layer?
Those go right underneath the red layers that we see out here. So there's a whole thick package of rocks that have been kind of churned up on edge right in here.
So that means all that we see on the left used to be here on the right. Is
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, so these layers, like this red layer, the Moenkopi, used to extend up and over. So there's a lot that's been eroded away in here. And as the Uinta Mountains pushed up, these layers would have extended over top of the Uinta Mountains. And so what we see is just the remnant that's left. And so as we look off to the north, we're looking out toward the Green River Basin. And so as these mountains rose up, it kind of made a high spot that water couldn't run through initially. And we had a big lake that formed out there. And all of this is happening approximately the beginning of the Cenozoic period around the Earth.
No, wait a second. You mentioned the Cenozoic. What is that? Where does it fit into all
Well,
of this?
geologists look at the history of the Earth in about 4 different times, if you will. And it doesn't matter if you're a creationist or a old Earth geologist, we all recognize about the same 4 periods of time. We think they had different lengths of time. The two views differ from each other, but the one that's deepest is the Precambrian. And we'll actually see those in the core of the Uinta Mountains. And then on top of the Precambrian, we have the Paleozoic. Here's some of the Paleozoic rocks, and we think these would have formed earliest in the flood. And then over here, beginning with these red rocks, that's the beginning of the Mesozoic. It means middle life. So we have Paleozoic, old life, Mesozoic, middle life. And then the most recent period is the Cenozoic, which means new life. And as creation geologists, I think these Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks would have formed during the flood year, so we have about a year's worth of time to form all that rock, and much of that we can see right in here. But then after the flood, as this erosion is happening, where is the sediment going? These mountains get lifted up, and then the eroded sediment is going into the big lakes that are forming out there. We often talk about a lot of these sedimentary layers being made during the flood. I think there's a lot of sedimentary layers that are going to be made after the flood as well. So we can piece together a whole series of events. So we know that these Paleozoic layers had to be made first, then the Mesozoic layers had to be made, the uplift happens, and then after the uplift, we get those lake sediments out there being laid down.
Are those lake sediments then laid down fairly close to the end of the flood, or?
I think they're laid down after the flood was over. So there's a lot of good reasons why we picture the Cenozoic as the end of the flood. And we see all these mountains rising up in the earliest part of the Cenozoic. And so if you have mountains rising back up and not getting eroded down by floodwaters, that's a hint geologically that the flood's over.
John, if all of those forces are lifting up the mountains at a time where all of those layers are still soft, then we wouldn't expect to see them crumble and break. Would we see them fold? Is that what we saw
That's right.
in the canyon?
That's right. So we're going to drive just a little ways from here into the core of the Uinta Mountains, and we'll see one of the limestones that's bent and deformed as this uplift took place. And that tells us that these rocks were moving around while the stuff was still soft, just shortly after it was laid down.
John, I have to admit, this is pretty impressive.
So we're looking at the brown rock here, which is the core of the Uinta Mountains. And we're looking at the tan rock up there, which is the Madison limestone. It's the same limestone that we see in Grand Canyon that we call the Redwall limestone there.
Okay.
The same kind of thing is happening here that happened in Carbon Canyon at the same time.
So the folding that we saw in Carbon Canyon, which doesn't seem to be nearly as massive as this, but it was the same kind of principle, right?
Yeah. So this entire area is getting lifted up. And especially here in the mountain ranges, as it gets lifted up, some of the Precambrian rocks are going to break. But they have soft sediments that are sitting on top of them. And so as the mountains lift up, the soft Paleozoic sediments get deformed, and that's that big bend that we're seeing in the rocks.
And it just folds. It's apparent to me when I'm looking at it that this was soft when all of that happened. Even in the vertical side here, we see some bending and folding.
Right.
John, also the thing that strikes me, we saw this layer in the Grand Canyon. I don't know how far away that is. It's a long ways away.
All the way across the state of Utah.
Right. But there are mountains in between there. And you couldn't get those nice flat layers if those mountains were there. So it's obvious the layers were laid down, the mountains were then pushed up, and because they were soft, then they folded instead of broke and were brittle like we see underneath.
Yeah, so that's correct, Del. All these layers in the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic rocks that we're talking about here, these had to be laid down before these mountains are pushed up, because those are the layers that are deformed by the mountains rising.
Yeah. You see these all over the earth, do you not?
Yeah, you do. You see some other big folds like this in places like the Alps, the Appalachian Mountains, and things like that. And again, it's the same argument that these rocks are bending because they're soft. They haven't hardened yet. The hardening takes place after the bending. You know, one of the things that we want to help people understand is how the Earth got its shape. Geologists like to use a word called geomorphology. And as a flood geologist, I think a lot of that shaping actually took place after the flood was over.
Well, we've talked a lot about the deformation of those layers, the soft bending, and so forth, but this is something different. John, it seems to me that we're in the middle of a layer. What is this?
This side used to connect to that side and everything in between. So there's a lot of rock that's been removed in here.
Yeah.
So let's start with where the rock layer itself came from. I think this layer was made during Noah's flood. I've studied this rock layer in some detail down in Arizona, the Coconino Sandstone, called the Weber up here. The layer extends all the way from California up to the Dakotas. And so this used to be solid across here. There was, no canyon here. This rock layer went all the way across. And my suspicion is this canyon has been cut by some catastrophe in the years after the flood. We see this in Grand Canyon, and we saw it at Mount St. Helens, and we see it here too. that you see these relatively small streams in relatively large valleys or large canyons. Even the biggest river we have in the United States, the Mississippi, even though it's a mile wide in places, it sits in a valley that's 100 miles wide. And we call those underfit streams, underfit valleys, or underfit canyons. And it means that the river flowing through them does not quite match the immense size of the valley of the canyon. My guess is 90% of the canyons and valleys around the world are underfit. And so we think that as mountains were lifted up and as erosion started to work on those mountains in the form of flash floods, in the form of mud flows, in the form of glaciation and so on, a lot of those processes could work on canyons like this and enlarge them pretty quickly.
John, it seems, at least to me, to say that all the things that carved this canyon out don't seem to be happening today. What's your take?
Yeah, and that's kind of a principle that I think is pretty true in geomorphology, is that a landscape goes through major changes catastrophically, maybe like one night at Mount St. Helens, and then the landscape just sits there until the next catastrophe. And so it's not that we don't have any catastrophes today, but I think the number of catastrophes that we have is declining from the large number of catastrophic events that we would have had as these mountains lifted up.
You've mentioned that post-flood era, that there was a tremendous amount of precipitation.
Yeah.
And so an area like this that doesn't really get a whole lot of rain.
That's right.
It was a drastically different climate at that time.
It was just to the north of here in Fossil Basin and Green River Basin. We've looked at, you know, the lush landscape that was there, the amount of vegetation that had to grow there, and the water that was there. And it's much different from the climate that we have here today.
I think from my perspective, as a geologist, climate change is the rule, not the exception. It's something that's been going on ever since the flood was over.
John, I think most people would look around here and say, this is a pretty bleak place. It's obviously very arid, and yet you're telling me this is a very special place.
Yeah, we're in the southwest corner of Wyoming. I spent several years up here in graduate school, and so we are standing on, I know it doesn't look like a lake as you look out here, but we're standing on the sediments that got laid down in a lake and now have turned into rock.
Yeah, the lake we're talking about filled up this whole basin, which is huge.
Yeah, and I can actually, from where I'm standing, I can see the edge of the basin over there. You can see these white sediments, and then those are truncated by the darker colored ridge right behind there. And the rocks in that darker colored ridge are actually sitting up like this. So that's the basin edge.
Is that then part of the evidence that you would say that this is post-flood? Because all of these are all very horizontal.
That's right. So the layers that we're looking at here, this is the early part of the Cenozoic, and that would be right at the top of the geologic column. And so we think that Cenozoic rocks in many places around the world, not everywhere, but most of these Cenozoic rocks we think are post-flood rocks. And so underneath of us, underneath of this basin, those Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks are contorted. But these Cenozoic rocks on top, these are horizontal and flat lying, they're not contorted at all. So that means that the tectonic activity had pretty much ceased when this lake basin was filled up.
So we have this basin, it's filled with water, and we obviously then have a lot of life. When we were in the museum, we saw, I don't know how many different species of just fish and all of that. So this was a flourishing area.
Yeah, it's amazing.
With all kinds of life. Where did all of this life come from?
So it's interesting. We see things like the bats, the horses, things like the alligators, and we know the birds. All those things, they were air-breathing animals. Many of them lived a lot of their life on the land, and they would have had to be animals that were on the ark. And something happens that's different from the rocks that we see underneath. We don't see many mammals in those rocks, and all of a sudden we get to these layers, and believe it or not, Del, there are more mammal species known in the rocks of the Green River Formation than are currently living in Wyoming today.
But that sudden arisal in the fossil record of mammals should tell us something.
Yeah, the very first bats that we find, the very oldest bats that we find are right here in this Green River Formation. And yet they have fully formed wings, they look like modern bats, and where in the world did they come from? Where are the transitional forms from the animals that gave rise to bats if the evolutionary model is true? And so one of the strengths we have in the creation model is that, you know, we can explain the sudden appearance of things like bats because we think that those would have been on the ark. And they didn't get fossilized during the flood, as far as we know. When we first find the bat fossils, they're in places like this, where they have the potential to become part of the fossil record here.
John, this.
So, what do you think? Gonna look at mountains differently now, huh? I know every time I go by something, you can just by not opening up a book, but just by going through some of these things, it explains it much better. So we'll have more of this next week. We'll finish it up. Lots more coming. They'll take a look at that sediment that they collected, because there were no hammers when we were there. No. Yeah, couldn't take anything. So, questions? Do you understand it all?
Sure.
That's why I'm gonna keep it here so you can take it home and maybe get a new textbook and look at it. It's all gonna be lies, but. So,
One question.
yes,
Last week when we explained like, what happened in Mount St. Helen
Mhm.
in May 1980.
1980.
And then 2 years later, and we just actually see the changes that occurred in a very short time.
Mhm.
And I just think about this, that you can make a connection to the Bible, you know, what happened. But when you think of evolution, they give you, let's call them facts, without any basis for that.
because they can't find the basis for them. They just kind of say the same. I mean, like he said here, we being creationists, we already have what
Template, yeah.
we already have the template, you know, God's moon, you know, basically brought the flood and all, and the rest of the stuff. So he's saying they don't have any. They're taking a look at what happened. What they see in the fossil record, but they're not going back to what the catastrophic stuff that was happening during that time frame with earthquakes and tectonic plates moving all over the place. The flood just, you know, pulverizing everything. But they're looking at what happens today. That's one of the things that they said a lot of times that's their fault. Because they're saying the time that it takes to do those things today, they're sending it all the way to saying this is what happened. The same thing is happening during whatever time frame that they're saying, which they prove it here that it's wrong. It's different.
They come up with a conclusion without having the facts.
And they force that conclusion on us and think, and you know, as most people would in today's world, those who say this is it, no, there's nothing else. You know, it's kind of an authoritarian type of way that that's the reason why it took them 4 years to be able to do what they were supposed to do here, to get the permit.
I think that's Second Timothy 2:15, that said, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And you really think about it, that here they haven't studied, they have just observed, like when you observation, you may look at something and you see something, whatever, and I look at it and I see something different.
Right, and that's one of the things that God put in us, you know, the Holy Spirit to say, okay, what about that rock? You know, what is nature? It's God's gift to us to say, look what I've done and how mighty I am. You know, one of the things that we had talked about is that, you know, we haven't opened, I'm not gonna say we haven't opened the Bible. During these, what is it, 20 weeks now?
19, will be
19.
19.
It'll be 19 next week. But it shows us that there are creation scientists out there that are actually doing great work. You've seen some of it, and you'll see some more of it next week with what they're doing. I find it. But I'm not saying that we're proving what the Bible says. But it sure is nice that it shows that the Bible makes a better answer and a better fit to what they're finding.
I would just say they were confirming what the Bible says.
Exactly. That's why we don't have a problem spending 19 weeks saying, this is confirming that the world around us is exactly what God said it was. And that we don't have to be under the thumb of the authoritarian paradigm that we're at. You know, we can teach our kids and our grandkids, now that I have one, about what really happened. And we can go out and take a look at it and say, this is really what happened. Those folds are pretty significant. It was, I mean, there's no way that it wouldn't have done it if it was hard rock. And that's what they were afraid that they would see in here, and why they took so long to be able to do that, get that permit to them. They had to sue to get it. So. Anything else? He's gonna dig up some fossils in here and stuff, and actually my mom had a couple of them that I have at home, so I'll bring it in. And it's really kind of cool. So. If there's nothing else, Tom, would you like to pray us out while I try to figure out where we are at? 51.
Okay, well, then, let's pray. Father, we thank you for the evidence that you've built right into the earth. And we thank you for the written word, the revelation from you that is true. And we see them lining up, and that gives us evidence to be able to share with people who have doubts around this earth and around your plan and purpose for it. And we're just grateful that we have these days to enable us to put forth, even before man, an understanding that makes sense because it relates to you, to what you have told us about in your word. Help us to further understand as we continue to read and study and so on, but make it usable not only in our life, but in the life of others as we share it. Thank you for what you have provided in Jesus' name.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.